So far, over like majority of like time, so far, so long as we've had cars, the inside of a car, the core component of a car is basically a piston. It works on a set of pistons laid out, and those pistons actually like produce the combustion that is needed to generate the power. So these pistons are located in cylinders in a row, and what basically happens is there are four main steps in how that combustion is created. There's the intake, the compression, combustion, and the exhaust. So what basically happens is during the first step, right, the intake, there's a valve, the intake valve, through which there's a mixture of air and fuel that's let in. And what this basically does is it comes through the valve and pushes the piston all the way down, right? And then in
Yeah.
the second step, in compression, the piston goes back up, and what this does is when it compresses that air fuel mixture to the top of the engine, that makes it more combustible, so that when it eventually lights on fire and it generates power, the power generated will be greater just because it gets compressed. Then at the
Yeah.
top, the spark plug, which is located near the top, right above the air fuel mixture, that generates a spark which ignites the mixture, and that basically sends the piston all the way down again. And this piston then generates that power and sends it to the crankshaft. And then finally, there's the fourth step, which is the exhaust, which is basically where the spent air fuel mixture is let out through the exhaust valve. And it's basically this series of four steps, just repeated over and over again, that is how the engine generates this power. And that causes the crankshaft to actually rotate, which actually leads to the term um, rotations per minute, revolutions per minute, RPM, right? And
Yeah.
the number of times that happens in a minute is how you measure the RPM of a car. And yeah, it's basically these four steps that really lead to the working of an engine.
Yeah. Oh, perfect. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Actually, it's actually magical. Almost imagine that just lighting fuel and air on fire in a small cylinder like that can somehow make a car go at these incredible speeds that we see cars going at today. Uh, the engine has definitely gone through a lot of sophisticated R&D and innovation over time for us to reach here. So really the way that we can arrange these pistons around in engines, these pistons, that's one aspect of it. A cylinder and a piston is just one aspect of an engine, which you can then configure in different ways to create different kinds of engines. I think most basic engine design is an inline engine where you have multiple cylinders put in all stacked up in a row, and they all work together to produce the kind of power that a car has. It's a very simple system. It's very easy to fix, very cheap, and in the starting, you used to have like an inline one engine, whereas only one cylinder producing a small amount of power. But as people wanted more power and cars to go faster and further distances, started adding more cylinders to it. So you made inline twos, inline fours, inline sixes, and the inline sixes and eights actually became very popular in the early days of cars to give them more power and give them more speed generally, because of having more cylinders created more horsepower. Uh, and that's the most basic engine design that you would see across a lot of cars. Another alternate design is a V engine design, which I think is more popular, and people have heard of V6 and V8 engines. Hushra, why don't you take us through the V design?
Okay, so the way these design names come up, I mean, it's fairly obvious. It's just the shape in which the pistons and the cylinders are aligned. So an inline, as Saksham stated, are just all cylinders in one vertical line, whereas a V arrangement would mean that the cylinders are equally distributed across two individual lines, which both cross to sort of form a V like this. And I would say, arguably, we hear the term V6, V8 a lot. And the reason we do is because naturally these are high displacement engines, which means they're found in most typically sports cars. And the reason they're found in sports cars is because a V arrangement, what it tends to do is it sort of compacts the space needed to fit a certain amount of cylinders. So they say it's very space efficient in the sense that you never hear really an inline 12 cylinder or an inline 10 cylinder, but you do hear
Yeah.
of a V10 and a V12. It's only because a V cylinder arrangement can arguably fit the same amount of power but in half the space. So when you have the same amount of power in half the space, it means if you have the same space, you can have twice the power. which is why
Yeah.
a V arrangement is just it's much more space efficient, and that space efficiency then gives rise to more scope to increase the power if need be, which is why I think a V cylinder, because it obviously has a common crankshaft with the connecting rods, is just a much better alternative in a race car where you need to cut down on weight and you need to have as compact a packaging of the powertrain as you possibly can.
Yeah, so like if you take it back to again the inline engines, so back in the day when cars were just coming around, old performance cars used to have an inline 8 engine, which was super long. They had these huge hoods with these big exhausts on them, very noisy, very it's really not suited to get the most efficiency out of the engine. They were very loud, they were always clunky, breaking down, and they created stability problems. Oppose that to a V8 engine, which again has 8 cylinders, but it's in a V configuration, takes up much lesser space, is much more efficient, more stable, and because of that, you're able to get the same amount of power as an inline 8, but in a much shorter length as compared to an inline 8. That's why V8s have become such popular engines that you would hear about almost everywhere. Yeah, so I think one of the most iconic, some of the most iconic cars with V engines in the V8 would be muscle cars. I think American muscle cars have been huge in the popularization of the V8 engine. In fact, Fast and Furious, again as an example, has a large assortment of muscle cars that are all V8 fitted, and all have this amazing V8 throaty sound. And then you would have cars with V10s and V12s. So, for example, the Lamborghini Huracan has a V10 engine. Lambo's very special V10 engine that is so iconic over the years. And Lamborghini Aventador has a V12, and Aston Martins too have a V12 engine, which is just 12 cylinders packed together and just generating an enormous amount of power in a short amount of space. And then I think the most important part of this entire lineup of V engine is the V6 engine, which is the current F1 engine that they use. They used to use V10s and V8s before, but now they've transitioned to a V6 turbo hybrid.